In today's Truth, I'll be talking about New Year's resolutions, the pros and cons around them, and how I was able to give up a variety of destructive behaviours. Thanks for tuning in, and today I'm talking about New Year's resolutions. I think a lot of people put themselves under a lot of pressure this time of year, and so I thought I'd share some of my experiences with dealing with addictions, as well as my observations of people who are trying to give up certain habits or addictions. So this could be anything from drinking, smoking, gambling, changing their eating habits, or a range of other, we'll call them destructive behaviours. Bearing in mind, of course, that in most cases, everything in moderation is fine. I think it's pretty safe to say that at this time of year, most people find themselves reflecting on the year that has just passed. I think the same thing happens around birthdays as well. Those milestone points during the year where we look at what we'd planned to achieve and what we ended up achieving. And being 2020, it's probably safe to say that for most people, a lot of things that they had hoped to do or planned to do didn't come to fruition. I had to cancel a planned overseas trip with my mother, so as has been the case for many people, if that's the worst thing that's happened to you this year, as in my case, you're probably doing all right. For many people, though, it's been a lot tougher. So changes to their work practices, working from home, children being homeschooled, changing the way we interact, and then there's those that have lost their jobs or had their hours reduced. And then there's those in the health services who have had to work longer hours and harder hours and at greater risk to themselves. And of course, don't forget those that, we had a neighbour that passed away, but it's been particularly tough for those that have had to grieve loved ones alone without the immediate support of extended family and friends. You could really spend hours going on and on about how things have been more challenging for people. But I think regardless of people's situations, we still come to this reference point at New Year. In the media at the moment, it's all about COVID. In the new year, things will be different. There'll be the vaccine and things will get back to normal, but it raises the question, what is normal? And for a lot of people, normal also isn't very healthy. Over drinking, lack of exercise, overeating, perhaps overworking. I think that's an addiction which far too often gets overlooked. So regardless of whether COVID was here or not, this phase of self-reflection always comes up. So at this point, I'll touch on my experiences with addiction and what I often call dangerous behaviour. That way you can understand why I think the way I do with respect to how people deal with their habits, and why I believe New Year's is probably not ideal for stopping a behaviour, or certain behaviours anyway. I just can't help but feel that when you're coming off a period of celebration and overindulgence, you might be setting yourself up for failure, which is okay, because every attempt at change, especially when it comes to addictions, gets you closer to ultimately achieving that goal. That whole idea of slowly chipping away at what most people, that idea of slowly chipping away at what you want to achieve. Most people would have seen the old quit smoking ads, the campaigns where quitting's like a muscle that builds up over time. I think it's meant to represent willpower. That's the muscle that builds up over time. The more often you try to quit, the more likely you are to eventually quit. So, for me, from my mid-teens, I started to indulge in dangerous behaviours that included, regular drinking from around the age of 15, and that was probably a fortnightly to a monthly thing. I'd already started smoking. I started smoking at 13, and then there was the gambling, which started when I was about 17. I'd sneak into pubs to play the gaming machines. I was betting on horses from the age of 16. The gaming machines for me was a step up from arcade games. Now I'll be dedicating an episode or two, or maybe even three or four, to gambling specifically at a later date. But so I won't spend too much time on it. But briefly, I think it's important just to reflect on how that addiction grew. I was transfixed by arcade games, arcade machines from the early 80s. From a very young age, from my first encounter at the local supermarket with my mother when I was about 7. By the time I reached my early teens, I already had what I would describe as a chronic addiction to arcade machines. And I could spend hours on this subject alone, hence the reason for the planned future episodes. I also started smoking pot when I was 16, and that was a bit more sporadic early on. It would gradually increase over time until I reached my late teens, early 20s, when it became quite heavy. And while I was at school, it was a fortnightly weekend kind of thing. But then as I got older and had more freedom, it became more regular, and it was maybe 3-4 times a week, getting stoned and sometimes drinking on the alternate days. I'll also address this subject in more detail in future episodes. So I just thought I'd touch a bit more on my experiences. So my behaviours would jump from one to another, but gambling was always a constant. I'd shift between heavy drinking and heavy pot smoking, with gambling always a common thread. That was the pattern for about 15, 20 years. As was working, that was also key. I always worked, for the most part, in jobs that I really didn't like. I was an electrician for 10 years, and I can honestly say that I hated it, hated every day of it. I guess the only thing that really made it bearable was the people I worked with, and of course the comfort that my income was able to bring me via my addictions. So the drinking and the pot smoking fluctuated, so one would be heavier than the other, and they'd take turns. Sometimes it was 6 months on, 6 months off, that kind of thing, and like I said, that went on for years. Sometimes I'd classify myself as a smoker for more than a year or two, and then go back to being a drinker for a couple of years, and that went on until I went traveling in the early 2000s. Just before I turned 30, I went to Europe for almost 4 years, and during this time it became more about drinking and less gambling. Gambling was nowhere near as accessible in Europe as it is here in Australia, particularly during those times. I realised pretty early on in the piece, when I was around 23, that these behaviours were destructive for me, and I sought out help. I went and saw a psychologist, primarily for gambling. At the time, I didn't see pot smoking or drinking as a significant issue. Back around that time, the therapist had recommended that I'd come back for more sessions, but I wouldn't end up seeking help again for another couple of years. It was 2 or 3 years before I went to see someone again. She she had been probing into my early childhood, and I just wasn't ready to go there. I was 23 at the time, and I just come off a relationship breakup, and I put it down to my gambling, but there was more to it, a lot more. And again, I'll be going into that in more detail in later episodes. But what I can say based on my experience and the vast amount of data out there is that at the core of most addictions, these destructive behaviors is some sort of traumatic episode that has led to the development of these patterns of behavior. So my destructive behavior went on for many, many years and fluctuated in terms of its volatility. That doesn't mean that I wasn't able to function. Remember, I was a workaholic, which means income to sustain my habits. And when I became a small businessman at the age of 33, there was more income available. So gambling became more of an issue as did drinking. Look, I never really stopped trying to work on the issues with my behavior. I saw various psychologists at different times, but I was also, and part of that was also dealing with depression and anxiety, and they're all connected. And I wasn't able to make a lasting change until it was 2014. I was 43 at the time, and I was referred to a new therapist, and the timing of that was pretty crucial as I was in a very dark place at the time. I'd been drinking heavily and I was gambling heavily. Drug use by this time had subsided. From time to time I might try something, but it was limited. It was more of a case of drinking, gambling, smoking, cigarettes, that is. So I saw this therapist, and I gave her the rundown as to how I'd been feeling, things I'd been dealing with in the past. I gave her the rundown, described my childhood traumatic experiences, as far as I'd dealt with them with previous psychologists. The therapy that I'd gotten into at various times during treatment in my 20s and 30s. And I gave her details about the treatment that I had undertaken during my 20s and 30s, and she said to me, well, she gave me an ultimatum during that first session. She said she could help me, but that I would have to stop drinking first and foremost, and if I did, she would take me on as a patient. It was strange because in the past I'd always been given the option, but not now, not in this instance. It had always been that, I should probably abstain from drinking, but it was okay to have a few. Just don't overdo it. None of them ever put their foot down like that, and that was exactly what I needed at that time. So I stopped drinking, I stopped smoking, I stopped gambling, and I also stopped coffee. That was something I hadn't mentioned earlier. Coffee's been a big one. For me, they all work together at different times. So they all feed into one another. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. The whole coffee and a cigarette. It was more of the adrenaline rush with the coffee for me. It was the pick me up from the night before. I would binge on the coffee the morning after binging on the alcohol the night before. So, half a dozen double shot espressos a day wasn't uncommon for me. So New Year's for me was always a reference point to look back at how I wanted to slow down, but I found it too difficult. In the years leading up to cleaning myself up, I found February and March easy to slow down. January was usually just too hard. I found that I would maybe stop for a few days after the Christmas and New Year bender period, but then find myself getting into it again soon after, like a few days later. Friends were off work, and the temptation was too hard to resist. I think what many people don't realize is that during this period, we are just consuming so much sugar with cakes and so much food and alcohol, and to try and stop that in one hit, it's just, I reckon it's lunacy, to be honest. It's nuts. With any drug, they tell you to wean yourself off. If you're addicted to pain medications or even antidepressants, and I forgot to mention those also. But again, that's another episode. It can be pretty harrowing to try and go cold turkey. I did it with antidepressants, and it was fucking wild. And the same goes for drinking and smoking. Most people would have met someone who's gone cold turkey, say, after cigarettes, and it's insane how irritable they get. So the reality for me was that until I was given an ultimatum, I couldn't get the help that I needed. And what it came down to for me was that my behaviours, those habits, were embedded in patterns. They were all interconnected, like a support network, and they were all related to trauma that I'd suffered as a young man. And whilst I'd touched on the trauma at various times throughout my adult life, it hadn't been fleshed out to the extent that it needed to be. And when I did, everything changed. When I saw the truth of the past and how it had altered my development and the subsequent effects on my behavior, it was easier to work out what needed to be done. I feel for many people who seek out help, that take that courageous first step and don't get the help they need. And in my experience, quite often it's just because the person that they're dealing with just isn't right for them. And that's what happened to me on numerous occasions. I tried different psychologists, and I was really up for doing some serious work on myself, but they just weren't the right person to be talking to. Maybe they'd remind me of someone, and that triggered something. Their energy was just off. There was something about them that just didn't click with me, and it didn't work. And this could have been just the relaxed type of demeanor that just wasn't what I needed, and it can be challenging, because people feel like, people think I feel sick, I go to my doctor, go to my GP, I've got a cough or a cold, go to the doctor, they give me something, get it sorted out. But when it comes to these types of issues, it's trickier. You really need to connect with your therapist on a certain level in order to get the results. And I think people need to understand that sometimes you have to shop around and not get hard on yourself. If you do go and talk to someone and things don't just magically go away, if you don't get the outcome that you're expecting, go somewhere else. Try something else. If you go to a male psychologist and it doesn't work out, try a female. If they're older and that doesn't work, maybe try someone younger, and vice versa, and keep trying, because there is someone for everyone. I firmly believe that. So yeah, I think it's essential to get help from a professional. If you've got an addiction or a bad habit, an addictive behavior, say you're a heavy drinker and you're just going cold turkey, see a doctor first. Have a chat, and then maybe get some support, some counselling. Same goes with any type of addiction, Just have a chat with your doctor. And if you don't have a good relationship with your doctor, then change doctors. I had the worst relationship with some of my doctors in my 20s. And then in my later adult life, I just changed a couple of times until I found someone that I could talk to and didn't have any issues talking to about anything. And it just makes so much of a difference to life in general. It's just makes stuff so much easier. And the thing about seeing doctors and therapists around New Year's is, guess what? They go on holidays also, they so maybe give yourself a plan to get onto it in February or March. And it just seems like it'll work a lot easier. So at this point, I'll quickly share some of my experiences as a service station operator. So I guess like any small business, you have your regular customers, and in the early years, I would spend a lot of the public holidays around this time of year, Christmas and New Year, at the service station, and usually in the mornings, basically because I was hungover and it was the best time to go in and do the paperwork that I needed to do and all that sort of thing. Maybe do a couple of orders. And what I found in those first few years was that many of my regular customers, the ones whose brand of cigarettes off the top of your head, they they just have that routine, and some of those regular customers would undertake to quit smoking. And more often than not, they would, buy bags of lollies instead of, cigarettes to compensate for the cravings. I'm sure everyone's heard of people that do that. And, I found myself talking to some of these customers, and more often than not, they were trying to lay off the drink as well, laying off the alcohol. And in most cases, they were back on the cigarettes by the end of January, usually not long after Australia Day. I think Australia Day has a lot to answer for when it comes to breaking New Year's resolutions, bringing people back to the cigarettes and the drink. I guess the other thing is that many people are on holidays, so there are more get-togethers, especially given here in Australia where it's summer. So it just makes it hard, to resist those temptations. I think later on during the year, when it gets a bit colder and daylight savings finishes, there are fuel parties going on, and you can maybe arrange that appointment with your GP, and he or she is available, and that counsellor that maybe you've been told about is also available, and it feels like it just feels like a more appropriate time to be working on what you need to work on, without the obstacles. There was one guy in particular. I remember it felt like he tried 3 years in a row to quit smoking, but it was in the middle of the third year it was in the third year, rather than just try and go cold turkey again at New Year's, he chose to slow down instead. And I guess he'd also built up that willpower muscle, that muscle, so that would have helped. But 3 years, that's a struggle. This guy was trying to quit for 3 years, and I distinctly remember having a conversation with him about it. He would talk about how he found it really difficult to drink and not have a cigarette, or have a coffee and not have a cigarette, and that conversation would come to mind for me some 10 years later when I gave up drinking and smoking and gambling and all of my dangerous habits. So yeah, one final thing that I would mention, and this came up in a conversation with a friend just a couple of days ago when I told him what I was doing the podcast on. And he mentioned that, he had this view that far too many people at this time of the year that they focus on what they should be doing less of. And I hadn't really looked at it in those terms before. Still, and it makes a lot of sense. People have this tendency to lean towards, less drinking, less eating, less harmful foods, less of everything, rather than having a focus on doing more positive things. And for me, that has made a big difference in my life. I completely changed my behaviours, and I forget that. I always seem to forget that. I always forget that to change my habits, I had to take up other behaviours. This took the form of writing. Back then in 2014, it was my blog, and I started writing a book, and that eventually led to acting. And especially in early mid 2015, there was a lot of stuff going on for me, and my business was falling apart, and I was under a lot of stress. And it was these creative outlets, these new behaviors that I had adopted, that I was doing more of, that got me through that first year of not drinking and not smoking and not gambling. And I tell you, I often thought about it, but it was, I look back now, and so there's a lot to be said for focusing on doing positive things with your time. And I think COVID has also highlighted that with many people. Doing stuff in the garden, for example. That's another thing that I do a lot of. Playing around in the garden, and a lot of people have done that during COVID as well. And and taking up things like podcasting and YouTubing, and many people have taken to these creative endeavors as well. So, I think it's just important to remember that if you want to make a change, you've got to put in that effort, and not limit yourself to just stopping those behaviors, but replacing them with new ones. So I think some of the most important things to remember are things like, don't be too hard on yourself. Maybe set realistic goals for the year. Plan things out. Be prepared to change those plans. If COVID's proved anything, it's that we're adaptable, and that when things aren't working, when processes aren't working, change them. Seek out help. See your GP. Get that referral for a therapist. Find the right therapist. Keep working at it, and when it doesn't work, change. Yeah. So that's just about it for this episode. I hope everyone has a safe and happy new year. In the next episode, I'll be sharing my truth about acting and how it has helped shape the last 5 years of my life. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts on any of the subjects raised here, I'd love to hear them. Happy 2021, and I'll catch you soon. This episode of One Day I Will Tell the Truth was produced by Tony Berea, sound designed by Robert Ferreira. An edited video version of this podcast will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming days. You can find details of all my podcast episodes, including full transcripts, edited video copies, and more about me at tonyberea.com. Thanks for tuning in.